almost 11 a.m. in Singapore and Shanghai. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Haslinda Amin, coming to you live from the 2024 Shangri-La Dialogue. Our top stories: Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts in his hush money trial, a verdict that could reshape the U.S. political landscape ahead of the presidential election. China's factory activity unexpectedly shrinking this month, a warning signal from a key sector driving the economic recovery. Plus, the rand slides as investors worry about what kind of coalition may end up governing South Africa. We get an election update live from Johannesburg. And of course, we've got a great lineup of guests joining us here this hour at the Shangri-La Dialogue front and center. Of course, U.S.-China relations, this on the back of rising geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits as well. Front and center, that handshake expected at 1 p.m. local time, where the defense chiefs of both the U.S. and China are expected to make. What is the significance of that? We'll bring you commentary and assessment very shortly. We'll be speaking to Timothy Haig, of course, the NSA director, for an assessment of relations between the two sides. Well, let's get you to markets. And of course, Avril Hong on top of that. And Avril, of course, it is about that weaker than anticipated data out of the U.S., but front and center as well, the PCE print that's coming up.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting setup for Asia markets today. You think about how the world's two economic powerhouses are showing data that is coming in softer. You saw how the US GDP print showed that slowing, no thanks to a bit of a softer consumer spending picture. Then we got those China PMIs, the factory activity unexpectedly shrinking. But I think for markets today, it is another case of bad news for the economy being good news for the markets. We initially saw a softer dollar as well, which helped some of the risk appetite among Asia-Pacific assets, and the stocks are mostly running higher. We also seeing the dollar picking up now, so that might be putting some of that pressure on the onshore-offshore yuan, the yen, Japanese currency sitting flat against the greenback. We, of course, also got Tokyo CPI numbers earlier today, and it shows that pickup. So it's pointing to potentially an acceleration in the nationwide trends when that data drops next month, perhaps making the case for the BOJ to mull those rate hikes. Still seeing that pressure then coming through on Japanese bonds. But let's flip the board because, as I say, we were looking really closely at the China PMIs as well, that unexpected contraction in factory activity. Why is this important? Because there was expansion for the past 2 months, and we were actually seeing that sector really supporting the recovery in China. So this is raising a bit of eyebrows, and it is also the biggest miss versus estimates in more than a year. These are the sub-indices that are not helping things along. Take a look at the output, the new orders, that slowing coming there for these manufacturers in China. Another concern as well from those trade tensions, maybe make it a bit trickier for them as well. Has.
All right, Avril Hong, we thank you so much for that update. Now, the Shangri-La Dialogue will be the first in-person meeting between U.S. and Chinese defense chiefs since China named a new defense minister. Let's discuss the expectations for this meeting and simmering superpower tensions with Timothy Haig, director of the U.S. National Security Agency and commander of the U.S. Cyber Command. General, good to have you with us. A lot of focus is on that handshake between the two defense chiefs. Can we get more than just a handshake?
Well, Haslinda, first, thank you very much for having me today. It's an honor to be part of the Shangri-La Dialogue and our opportunity to meet with any number of colleagues throughout the region. As we think about today, from our organizations, from the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, really looking at two things. One is, what are the threats within the region? What are the tensions and what's causing them? And then also, what are the cyber risks? So when we look at the current tensions, when we look at really what we would like to be able to ensure is peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits, in the South China Sea. And increasingly, we see China's actions to be threatening in those areas. The activities around Taiwan over the last week, also threats to the Philippines, as well as Vietnam and Japan. And so those are areas from our perspective, we inform those threats to our policymakers to allow them to have a dialogue that's informed by the facts and the current environment.
What's the key message the U.S. would be sending China as this dialogue?
Well, I think from my perspective, what I've informed is what are the current activities? What do they look like? The other area is the things that we see in the cyberspace domain. And so we've done extensive reporting, both inside our government and then publicly, about some of China's actions, particularly as it relates to critical infrastructure in the United States, and also the theft of intellectual property globally. And so we want to ensure that all of our policymakers understand those actions. So as they engage in dialogue, it's ensured that they're built off of what we know is the best information available to them.
We know that military ties between the two sides resumed about a year ago. How are you assessing relations? Are they better than a year ago, given how aggressive China has been in areas like the South China Sea as well as the Taiwan Strait?
So I think what we see is we're informing with the Secretary of Defense's engagement today is we think any time that there's communication is good, because from our perspective, what we want to ensure is that there's a clarity in terms of the areas that we're discussing, informed by what are the current sets of activities and how we each perceive them. So I think from the perspective that there's increased communication is certainly a positive, but we also see areas that we're informing that we would be concerned about.
We've seen a lot of aggression in the South China Sea. We've had the president of the Philippines pushing back, saying that he wants to normalize relations, get relations back on an even keel. Would developments in the South China Sea perhaps derail efforts to normalize relations between the two sides?
That, I think, I really defer that one to our policymakers. What we're doing is we want to ensure that we're working with partners in the region so that we're also enhancing their capacity, their understanding. We work very closely with U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in their work to ensure that we are also able to provide stability in the region through our own military operations, whether that be through partnership and exercise, but also our ability to communicate those threats not only to our policymakers, but to our allies and to our partners.
General, we talk about how volatility around the region is rising. It's not just in the Asia-Pacific area, but also in Ukraine as well as in the Middle East. What is the U.S.'s priority? How is it looking at the escalating tension in the world today? Some say perhaps it's a case of, a weakened U.S. that's leading to all of this.
So I deal with each of our partners in the region. So just like in the Indo-Pacific, we work with Admiral Paparo as the Indo-Pacific commander, and he has his resources to be able to focus on the threats here. We work very closely with General Cavoli, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and the European commander. And we are ensuring that he understands threat, he has forces aligned to him, and he has a very strong partnership with the Ukrainians to be able to enable their defense from the unlawful invasion from Russia. Similarly, as we saw over the events of the last month, the United States has had the ability to assist Israel in its defense, particularly from attacks directly from Iran. So I think we have aligned ourselves, and from our two organizations that are globally focused, we have aligned our resources to be able to handle the priorities that our policymakers have given us.
But what are the red lines? A lot of people have been asking where the red lines are for the U.S., given recent developments that you mentioned. Is the U.S. clear on where the red lines are? Or is that too big a price to be revealing it today?
Well, I think from my perspective, policymakers set whichever lines that we want to do. Our job is really to be able to do two things. Be able to inform from an intelligence perspective what's happening, and then also to give options to our policymakers, whether those be things that we see as potential operations from a military perspective, or informing how other activities are going, like the humanitarian aid or things like that. We want to be able to inform those so our policymakers have the best available information, both from an intelligence perspective and operationally, as they make decisions on any of those areas.
I just want to get a sense of the U.S. thinking. If you take the South China Sea, for instance, what would it take to trigger the mutual defense agreement?
Yeah, that one is an area that is really outside of my purview.
What's your understanding of it?
Yeah, so I would look more to, I take requirements from our nation's leadership and from our military leadership. And they give us a very clear understanding of what are the things they need to know so it can inform any decision making. The other areas that I think we also assist in is the ability to build partnerships so that we can avoid getting to a crisis. And I think that's an area that an environment like this is very helpful with 40 other nations here, where we can talk about these common issues and how do we avoid crisis through our close partnerships, through our exercise, and through our opportunities to open dialogues.
Given all these efforts, would you say that the U.S. is now closer to its allies as well as its partners in this part of the world?
Absolutely.
All right. General, hang tight. U.S. National Security Agency Director Timothy Hawk is sticking around. Of course, we're coming to you live from the Shangri-La Dialogue, still ahead this hour as markets await India's first quarter GDP numbers. We discuss the state of the economy with Citi's MD and Chief India Economist Samiran Chakraborty. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
Donald Trump there, as well as Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, reacting to the former president's conviction on all 34 charges he faced over hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels. Now, Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, now carries a tag unlike that of any other presidential hopeful in U.S. history, that of a convicted felon. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Derek Walbach. Derek, will the tag affect his election chances?
Well, Haslinda, I think that's very much to be determined right now. I think if you are looking over the political landscape, and it is a landmark day, let me just say, this is the first time that we've had a former president of the United States convicted of charges like this. Trump was found guilty on all of the charges. And there's really not a precedent for this in the past. So you sort of sit there and you look at this as a national election in a deeply divided country, and you say, well, a lot of this seems to have been baked in. Republicans overwhelmingly, near unanimously, are sticking by their man, staying with Trump. Even people who have criticized Trump in the past, like Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, coming out and saying that the charges should never have been brought. So there's high degree of unanimity on the Republican side of this. You could even suggest, based on some donation data, some early indications, that there may be more enthusiasm on the Republican side.
Derek, you got to wonder what Trump's next move might be.
Well, Haslinda, I think we are all bracing for an appeal in this case. I do think that they are looking for a way to appeal. That can't happen until after the sentencing, which is going to be in a couple more weeks. I think that politically, you're going to see the Trump campaign continue to do what it has been doing and make the case that Trump has been wronged somehow in this process. I think one of the key things that I'm watching for over the next weeks is how this plays with independent voters. As I said, this is about a coin flip election. Worst case scenario, you figure Trump has a 50% chance of winning right now. And I'm interested, YouGov did a flash poll after this, and they asked Americans, they said, do you think that Trump got a fair deal in this case by a 10-point margin, 47-37 thereabouts. They said that they thought that he did, and by about a 20 percentage point margin, they said that they thought that he was actually guilty there. If you're looking at those independent voters, that's really where this is going to be important, because this is not an overall first past the post kind of election where the person with the highest number of votes wins, right? The U.S. is different for a presidential election. It's a compendium of state votes in the Electoral College. And so when you're looking at some of these swing states, your Wisconsins, your Michigans, your Pennsylvanias, you're really talking about just a couple of votes. I always have in my mind has the former one of the former campaign heads of Al Franken's race when he became a senator. He won that by just over 300 votes. I asked her at one point, I said, what was the difference? And she said, Derek, in a race of that margin, everything can be the difference. And that's really the case in swing state after swing state across America. It may be very well that tight. Anything could make a difference.
Our own Derek Waldbank, we thank you so much for your assessment today. Of course, we'll continue to track developments. Now, today's big take is also about Donald Trump. Find out why Wall Street's billionaires are rushing to throw their weight behind the former U.S. president, even after his guilty verdict. Subscribers can read about that on the terminal. And our big take is your function, or head over to Bloomberg.com. Timothy Hawk, director of the U.S. National Security Agency and commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, is still with us. General, good to have you with us. We had Trump being convicted of all 34 counts, but according to some polls, he has a 54% chance still of winning the presidential race. What might a Trump 2.0 mean for relations in the Asia-Pac, in Southeast Asia?
So I think, Haslinda, this is an area that I know I'm not qualified to discuss in terms of the Department of Defense. We're an apolitical organization, so we will serve any of our elected leaders. I think as I look forward, the next thing that we're focused on is our election defense. As we think about ensuring that the role that both NSA and Cyber Command play, to be able to support our domestic agencies of Homeland Security and our FBI with any threats to our election from any foreign interference. So it's a mission that we work very closely to consider both cyber threats and then threats that could occur in the information environment. And that's really the area that we're focused on at NSA and Cyber.
Before we pick up on cyber threats, let's talk about disinformation, misinformation, and some say Trump himself is responsible for that. How do you view that?
So we are focused on foreign threats. So as an intelligence agency in the United States, we do not do any work inside the United States. We're focused on foreign threats. So we're looking to see if there's any nation state that will attempt to influence our election or our population is the focus of our mission.
And has that cyber threat increased?
So from a cyber perspective, we watch that closely. And in terms of what it looks like in today's environment, certainly there have been increasing cyber threats. One area in particular has been in ransomware. So when we see that has really been a global impact of attempting to be able to use ransomware to get money from companies or to extort money from companies by gaining access to information. That's one of those threats. The other threats are from nation states. And we've done a significant amount of reporting, increasingly unclassified, publicly available reporting that articulate these threats. And one of those is really around how China has targeted critical infrastructure. And our goal is to be able to share that information as widely as we can with partners, with industry, so that we can now collectively defend against those type of threats that would impact not just the United States, but our partners in this region in terms of very similar cyber threats that they face.
We know it is a huge year for elections. We have one in South Africa. The counting is happening like right now. I'm headed to India for the results of that election. How are you assessing how perhaps countries are protecting themselves against these threats, and what's the role of the U.S. in that?
So I think in general, it's about education. So it starts there. Where do people go to get their information that they validate is true? and ensuring that the more we're educated on how to consume information is a start point. And that's really at a national level. From the particular identification of threats, our Department of State puts out an annual report that we work closely with them on. It's called the Pillars of Disinformation. And what that report does is it lays out threats by nation as to the techniques they do, the manner in which they do disinformation, and it allows those anyone from any other nation to pick that up to use as a start point, and then a potential area that we can collaborate with them on as to what these threats look like and what it poses potentially for an election or for any other issue that's happening within a nation.
So linked to that are semiconductors. We know that the U.S. is clamping down on China's access to it, and now a clampdown perhaps in the Middle East as well. I mean, how are you assessing that now?
So I think from our perspective, what our role is to understand a number of things. One is, what is the current state of the technology? How do we communicate within the government an understanding of, in this case, as our government has considered withholding some of that capability from China, what's their current status? What is their intended use for that technology? How we inform that discussion then allows our policymakers to be able to make a decision that's consistent both with our laws and our policy and the overall objectives to ensure free and fair trade and really to ensure that we're also able to have a conversation around the facts and what are those particular technologies that are most important.
In the early days of the Ukraine war, it managed to fight off cyber attacks to its infrastructure. How has that threat evolved 3 years on?
So it continues, and Ukraine has been very resilient. And I think that's one of the lessons that any nation can take away from how Ukraine has approached this with many partners. First and foremost, they thought about resilience, both in how they defended their own infrastructure, how they partnered with others to make that infrastructure more resilient, but also how they used cloud infrastructure to make themselves more resilient to attack. So I think that at the outset, key lesson learned was resilience. As it has evolved, we've also seen how Russia has approached this conflict. They continue to use any means available to target Ukraine as part of their unlawful invasion. Areas that we see is them attempting to take information from Ukraine to be able to use that against the Ukrainians in any number of ways. We continue to support European Command as they do efforts with Ukraine to help them secure their infrastructure, secure their data, and support them in any way consistent with U.S. policy.
We know that the U.S. is working closely with Ukraine to perhaps stop Russia from tapping Starlink. How is that going? How will that work? And where are we with that?
I think what we have seen is that any number of commercial providers to Ukraine, Starlink included, have been very resilient. And they've given Ukraine options as they defend themselves. It's another lesson I think we take away is that from any nation, the number of options that are available in terms of ensuring communication, in many cases ensuring that President Zelensky was able to communicate to the world, and also that we are enabling and defending and providing information that would allow any company to be able to take that information to ensure that they're defending.
You talked about how the U.S. is helping to build resilience. Where is the weakest link? Where needs help?
So one of the ways that we think about this is when nations ask for assistance. And so within U.S. Cyber Command, we do a series of operations that are called Defend Forward, where when they ask us, we will send a team of experts to them. And we do a number of things together, shoulder to shoulder. One of them is whatever network they identify that they're concerned about, we'll work together to identify are there vulnerabilities and are there attempts at hacking that infrastructure that we can then close. And at different times, we'll also expose that activity because it really does help others learn from that. So I think first and foremost, the number one threat are vulnerabilities that are latent in networks. And the ability for people to close their own vulnerabilities is one. The second is we're really seeing China be very aggressive to use their industry to find those vulnerabilities, keep them private, and target them. So that's why we are rapidly working with any number of nations to expose wherever we can what vulnerabilities exist in systems and also Chinese actions to take advantage of that.
All right, General, we have to leave it there. U.S. National Security Agency Director Timothy Hawk there. Of course, markets taking a breather. rising a little bit on the back of that softer-than-expected data out of the U.S. Of course, that's prompting expectations that perhaps we might just see that rate cut from the Fed this year. Of course, front and center, we're keeping a watch on that dollar and how that's impacting, in particular, with currencies in this part of the world. We've seen a lot of pressure on the yuan, the Chinese yuan, of course, and how the yen has been under pressure as well. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets Asia. We're seeing China markets just about to head to lunch, so let's take a look at what we're seeing on the mainland. Today is really dominated by the data that we got, those China PMIs showing that unexpected contraction in factory activity, a sector that has been driving the recovery of the Chinese economy. So that's raising some concerns about how uneven things are looking. But if you take a look at the performance across assets, it looks like a pretty muted one. CSI 300 still showing some gains. The Hang Seng is rising in line with its other Asian benchmark counterparts. And even on the yuan, it looks pretty flat against the greenback. And Eugenia Victorino from SEB offers this perspective. She says there is some investor optimism that there's stabilization in the property sector is going to help to offset any pullback in manufacturing. And as long as those U.S. yields remain capped, dollar China can cap some of the upside. So that's what we're seeing across assets in China. Let's flip the board and take a look at what we're seeing in Japan. We have the markets there coming back from the lunch break. The Nikkei has been pretty buoyant for much of this session. And this is against the backdrop of that data coming out of the U.S., so showing that slowing in the U.S. GDP, raising hopes of Fed rate cuts. And that seems to be helping some of the risk appetite. The bank stocks are the ones that are helping to lift the indices, though, as we see those higher yields in Japan. Something else to note as well is the likes of Tokyo Electron and Lasertech. Those shares are actually dragging the benchmark, given the Dell AI server sales coming in, and they didn't really impress investors. So that is what we're watching in Japan. But flip the board as well, because as we talked about earlier in the program, we did get those Tokyo CPI numbers. And if you look under the hood, even though there was a pickup, that points to an acceleration on the nationwide print that's due next month, supporting the case for the BOJ to mull those rate hikes. The pickup was largely due, and this is something that our Bloomberg colleagues have flagged, due to the renewable energy surcharges. So if you look under the hood, the picture looks a bit more mixed, but still Tokyo CPI trending in the right direction for the BOJ. Has.
Avril Hong, thank you. In the FX space, the South African rand is under pressure as investors fret over the outcome of the country's elections. A model developed by a state research agency suggests the ANC could lose its parliamentary majority for the first time since it came to power 3 decades ago. Well, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabasaja joins us live from Midrand in South Africa. Jan, set the scene for us.
Yeah, good morning to you, Haslinda. Look, I am in Midrand, as you mentioned, at the election center. It's still pretty early here, but really it's been quite a busy past few 24 hours because, as you mentioned, that government agency projection is projecting that the ANC could potentially drop below that 50% majority that they have held for the past 30 years. And right now, we're at about 50% of votes of districts that have voted, that have been tallied. And so we still have a bit of a ways to go. But really, the activity in the markets yesterday really indicates that investors are now wondering sort of what the discussion talks are going to be potentially for a coalition, if that is the new era that this South African government is going to be entering. And if you could just see behind me, this is where we are paying very close attention to. It has a number of the districts, all of the districts and the provinces that we're paying close attention to. And what we saw on Thursday is the ANC really struggling to gain the support in the biggest provinces that we're paying close attention to, which is Gauteng here, based, which includes Midrand and Johannesburg, and also KwaZulu-Natal, which we have seen former President Jacob Zuma's very newly formed party, the MK Party, doing surprisingly well. So the question now, though, is what does the rest of the day look like, especially as we pay close attention to Gauteng, which is the most populous province, most populous province, what that looks like as we continue to get more and more votes counted.
Jan, you talk about how the ANC probably underperformed its own expectations. What are the implications of that?
Right. So the big question is, if the ANC does continue to stay below this threshold that many investors were saying was not their base case scenario, who then are they going to turn to become a partner with, to form a government, because that is what they are going to need in order to elect President Cyril Ramaphosa for his second and final term. What we have heard in the past, if it is the MK party, will they work together with the ANC? We have heard from both parties potentially that is not something they would do, although yesterday we heard from MK Party spokesperson saying that they potentially would be open to that. And if not them, would they turn to the main opposition party, the DA, to form a government and move forward? And so it's going to be really interesting, the coalition talks, once we get more votes counted, how they are happening behind the scenes, because over the past few months during this campaign trail, we've heard a number of these parties say that without a doubt they will not work together. And so, but in order for the ANC to re-elect President Cyril Ramaphosa, they are going to need partners if these projections hold further.
Jen, talk to us about the sentiment on the ground.
So, Haslinda, it's interesting. It has been over 24 hours since the votes started being counted, but still people are saying it's a bit too early. So, a lot of the sentiment I would describe as being uncertain at this point in time, just because we do not know what sort of tie-up or partnership is going to look like. We haven't yet heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa since we saw him voting in his hometown back on Wednesday. And so, we're trying to figure out really what are the discussions that are happening now, what could the government potentially look like, and how are they going to be able to address a lot of the issues that have been plaguing this economy, namely 33% unemployment, many of them being young people. We have an economy that has not grown as much as it should be. This year projections are maybe growing just over 1%, and we've had electricity outages, port and rail infrastructure not performing in the way that they have. And so, people are ready to see a government that is ready to do something, but whether or not they'll be able to do that is the big question.
Jan, great stuff. Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabasaja in Midrand, South Africa. We're going to take you back to the Lion City with elections spanning from India to the U.S. this year. The implications of these democratic exercises ripple far beyond national borders. For more on the key themes facing the Shangri-La dialogue, we're joined by Sir John Chipman, Executive Chairman of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which convenes this defense summit. So, John, good to have you with us. How significant is the summit coming in a time when geopolitical tensions are rising all around the world?
Well, as you say, in all three significant strategic theaters, the North Atlantic area, where there's a war against Ukraine, in the greater Middle East, where there's this hard struggle between Israel and Hamas, and here in the Asia Pacific, where one feels on the brink of tension almost on a day-to-day basis. This meeting that brings together so many defense ministers, not only of the Indo-Pacific, but also from Europe, North America, and the Middle East, is very important. We recall that 2 years ago, Prime Minister Kishida of Japan said at this dialogue, Ukraine today could be Asia tomorrow, and the defense ministers convened here will be trying to engage in the defense diplomacy to prevent Ukraine today being Asia tomorrow.
Is there added importance this year, given that we're seeing the biggest election year for the world?
Well, I think in some cases the elections don't particularly matter. We've had a very important election in Indonesia, and we're very proud that we have President-elect Prabowo speaking at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue on Saturday afternoon. We're very pleased that we have on Friday evening President Marcos of the Philippines giving a perspective from a small state of the challenges in this region. I think what we all look for is, whatever the results of the democratic elections in various countries, that more institutional connection can be made between the various countries here in order to ensure that lines of communication are open and those valves are used, especially at times of military tension.
I guess the perception up there is that perhaps it's difficult to get more than just talk, more than just a handshake for the cameras. How optimistic are you that this dialogue would perhaps generate more significant consequences?
Well, I think that this year it's very important that it is likely that U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin will meet his opposite number, Defense Minister Dong Jun of China. That would be the first face-to-face meeting for almost 2 years between a U.S. and Chinese defense minister. What I hope that they will discuss at that is trying to find ways in which the theater commanders in China can speak to their opposite numbers in Indo-PACOM of the United States. So the idea would be to thicken out the institutional arrangements for communication. So I think that will be very important. But we've also seen in the last few years so many little mini-lateral arrangements being made as between the states who are trying to engage more outside powers in this region to ensure that while China speaks of a multipolar world, we don't find ourselves in Asia in a unipolar Asia.
China, of course, like you said, is looking for a multipolar world, a world where there are more power centers than just the U.S. Might we be headed that way anyways? I mean, we're seeing, the increasing significance of the middle powers, for instance.
Well, it's true that China wants to make certain it is the biggest resident power in the Indo-Pacific. It would prefer the United States to be absent, but as it happens, a number of ASEAN countries, and of course Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, want the United States to keep its own resident power approach. What the middle powers are doing are finding all sorts of arrangements amongst themselves to make life a little bit easier for them. Philippines in particular, having signed about 6 or 7 new defense agreements under President Marcos's leadership.
So, John, what are some of the major themes emerging for this particular summit?
Well, I think maritime security, as always, here is important. There are increased concerns about tensions in the South China Sea. One of the leading Filipino businessmen only 2 or 3 days ago talked about the need for Philippines to be able to exploit energy resources in the West Philippine Sea. Well, that's an area where the Chinese partly claim sovereignty. So also the question of how the economies of the region move on while there's this constant political tension that affects the confidence of outsiders in the region sometimes.
In your conversations with all the defense chiefs and defense representatives, what's the sense out there about how the U.S.-China tensions might play out?
Well, I think everybody is just looking to see whether we can create a stronger set of relationships between the U.S. and China. Of course, the United States position is that on technology, they want to protect a small garden around which they want to build high walls. I think in this part of the world, they're worried that that garden might become very big and the walls even higher. So I'm sure that this issue of geotechnology, so to speak, will also be raised by a number of the speakers at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue.
Just one final question before we let you go. Trump has been making headlines today. He's been convicted for all 34 counts. But there's still a chance he might be the president. How might that shape the political landscape, both in the U.S. as well as its relations with this part of the world?
Well, I think in Asia, everyone knows that President Trump does want to have a winning position with regard to China. And you can only have a winning position with regard to China if you want to be engaged in the region. So I don't think there's a worry that under the Trump administration, the United States might pull back. There might be a worry under the Trump administration that instead of merely competing from time to time with China, on all counts, a Trump administration would want to win. And if that's the case, there will be more U.S.-China tensions.
There have been a lot of questions about how committed the U.S. would be to its partners and allies in this part of the world. Under a Trump administration, do you think he will still be committed, or will it be a U.S. first policy?
I think the Trump administration will be committed to its major allies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, in this region. Trump is known to be transactional, so he might charge them a little bit more for the U.S. military presence in their countries.
So, John, thank you so much for joining us. John Chipman, Executive Chairman of the IISS. We're coming to you live from the Shangri-La Dialogue here in Singapore. Now, still to come, Citi MD and Chief India Economist. We're talking about Samiran Chakraborty. He'll be joining us with his outlook for the Indian economy and how he's factoring in the heat wave and the elections. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
You're watching Bloomberg Markets Asia, and we're seeing India markets just opening. Some reprieve coming for the stock markets there after a 5-session losing streak, just about managing to snap that. I think getting a bit of reprieve and tracking what we're seeing across the rest of the Asia Pacific as investors also keep an eye out for the Fed's preferred gauge of inflation, that data on PCE that is due later today. The greenback has been picking up slightly, and we're seeing still, even in the face of that, the rupee covering some lost ground. Now, this is what we're seeing in the stock markets. Let's take a look at what we're seeing in the GDP expectations. Of course, we're going to get the full year number today, and it's expected to show a growth of almost 8%. And this could be a boost to the Modi government, especially as we keep an eye out for those election results next Tuesday. And ahead of that, of course, we're going to be watching very closely for what we get out of those exit polls, Has.
That's right. Let's preview those GDP numbers. Let's bring in Samiran Chakraborty, Chief India Economist at Citi, which is holding its Macro Pan-Asia Investor Conference in Singapore this week. Samiran, good to have you with us. So your expectations for the GDP number?
We think it has been quite a resilient quarter for growth, looking at around 6.5% to 7% kind of a GDP print, which should mean that for the full year fiscal 24, we should be somewhere around 7.6 to 7.8 on the overall GDP. Yes, we have a little bit of divergence in the drivers of GDP, where it's driven more by the investment side of the economy rather than the consumption side of the economy. But the key question would also be the divergence between the GDP numbers and the GVA numbers, which has been a bit of a concern for investors. But we think that in this quarter, the divergence should narrow down to some extent, with only a 50 basis point divergence versus a 180 basis point divergence, which was seen in the last quarter.
So what's the longer-term outlook for India, given what you have just said? It is investment-led and consumption has been pretty lackluster.
I think the government is focusing a lot of supply-side measures, trying to create more infrastructure capacity, more manufacturing capacity. And the optimism is that with these supply-side measures, we will see more employment growth, more income growth, and that will finally make the demand side also recover. At this moment, like in a lot of other places in the world, we are also seeing some sort of a divergence between the higher end spending and the lower end of the spending. We think that this will narrow down as we progress, because India has a huge demographic dividend to work with. So we think that around 7 to 7.5% GDP growth over the next few years is quite doable. And if we do the right kind of reforms, then possibly we can push it up to even 9 to 10% as well. And given India's demographics, that's something which we need to aspire for.
This is a government that's looking at fiscal consolidation. Might that impact its investment plans, you think? Might that slow down, for instance, spending on infrastructure?
So at least for this year, the government has got a surprise bonanza from the RBI in the form of larger than expected dividend of almost 0.4% of GDP extra. So when the new government presents the budget sometime in July, they will have the choice of using this 0.54% of GDP either for deficit reduction or expenditure increase. So even if they use up part of this for higher capex, then at least for the next year, the capex growth should be maintained. The bigger problem is not the money. The bigger problem is that we have to create the institutional capacity to spend this money in a more productive way for infrastructure development, not just in roads and railways, but in a wider variety of public capex, including places like urban infrastructure, water, power, etc. So it's a long process, and I think the government is quite committed to it, because that's how we will reduce our cost difference between India and rest of the world on manufacturing side. And that could make India the manufacturing powerhouse which it wants to become.
One of the big questions in the market is when the RBI will start cutting rates. When do you see a pivot from the RBI? Do you expect it to be able to be independent of the Fed, or will it be waiting on the Fed?
Our sense is that RBI is very committed to seeing the 4% inflation target to be met, not just comfortable with any number between the 4 to 6 range that it is there right now. So from that perspective, RBI will probably wait for a few more months. Maybe around October is when we start seeing the first rate cut. That's because by then they will have visibility that in 2025, inflation is aligning towards the 4% mark. They will also have clarity on how the monsoon has progressed, and will have better clarity on how the global rate cycle is evolving, including in Fed. So that kind of gives them the right backdrop to start the easing cycle. So October is our call for the first rate cut, but it will be a very shallow rate cut cycle, not expecting more than 50 basis point of rate cut this year.
Samiran, surging temperatures in India, 52 degrees right now. How might that impact the economy?
So this is quite unprecedented, and obviously there is some fear that this can feed into inflation. Our sense is that this is not an immediate thing, because we just had the winter crop harvest, which was quite good. So how this filters into the summer harvest is what we need to see. As of now, the prediction is that this is going to be a good year for monsoon. All the forecasts are talking about a normal monsoon, no El Nino effect this year. So that could potentially mean that you somehow able to scrape through this period without much inflation effect. My only worry is that if this heat wave has affected the quality of the winter crop, then maybe it filters into inflation with a 3 to 6 month lag.
Samiran, thank you so much for your time today. Samiran Chakraborty, Chief India Economist at Citi. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
Or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges. Britain's next.
Fed was going to keep rain World Cup. This is a 3.
As the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Well, our coverage of the 2024 Shangri-La Dialogue will continue throughout the day. Some key things we're watching out for: the first in-person meeting between U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun will be taking place, expected at least at 1 p.m. local time. Of course, we have military relations between the two sides resuming only about a year ago, but still a lot of pressure on relations, especially on the back of the U.S. reimposing tariffs on U.S. imports. We're also keeping an eye on the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s keynote address, of course. That's happening tonight. We know tensions in the South China Sea has been rising. We'd like to take a temperature check on where they're headed. Of course, we have Marcos insisting time and again that the Philippines is taking measures to bring relations back on an even keel. He talks about not wanting to poke the bear. We'll also be speaking with Lithuanian Prime Minister Ingrida Simonita this afternoon. Of course, Lithuania among Baltic states vulnerable to a Russian imperialist, goals. Will take a pulse on where relations are headed. In the markets, of course, a lift from that softer than expected data out of the U.S. That is it from Bloomberg Markets Asia. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. This is Bloomberg.